Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me for the screencast lecture in which we're going to take a look at the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. We're really going to focus on his domestic and foreign policy while he's president throughout most of the decade of the 1950s. If you have any questions about the content covered in this video, you want to refer to Chapter 20 of your textbook. It'll be there. And furthermore, too, please make sure you're taking some detailed quality notes as we're going through the content of this video. Feel free to stop, pause, go back in the video as needed to help those notes. So to start off, let's take a look at the campaign of 1952, which is when Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected president. So we've kind of talked about this already, the election of 1952, when it pertains to the Korean War, we discussed it. Remember, in 1952, the Korean War is well into the swing of things. It's actually approaching a stalemate in 1952 and in 1953. And the Republicans know if they run the right person, they can secure the White House, which they desperately wanted because we had not had a Republican president in about 20 years. Herbert Hoover was the last Republican president, and he did not win a re-election in 1932. FDR beat him. So again, 20 years, the Republicans has been seeking control of the White House, and this is their chance. So there's no one better, they claim, to navigate through the early Cold War years, the stalemate emerging in the Korean War, than a five-star U.S. military general like Dwight D. Eisenhower. So that's why he's selected. He's a well-known figure. He's a war hero, the architect of D-Day, and it can't go wrong. Furthermore, they also strengthened the ticket by adding a young up-and-coming Republican, and that's going to be Richard Nixon. We looked at him and his role in HUAC and really taking the lead in hunting down communist spies, communist sympathizers within the United States. And so these two are going to be really a dynamic ticket that's going to lead the Republicans to victory and take the White House back. So here's the breakdown of the election. It's not a landslide, but it's a pretty secure victory. The Democrats really struggled in the 52 election. A lot of the things that we've looked at that Truman was doing was unpopular. Also, too, Truman's stance on civil rights issues had caused the Democratic Party to splinter into those southern sort of state rights supporters of the Dixiecrats, and that's going to be a problem for the Democratic Party in this 52 election. So once elected president, let's take a look at some of Eisenhower's policies. First, I want to start looking at domestic policies. So many historians look at Eisenhower's presidency and they label it something called modern republicanism. So when Eisenhower's elected in 52, many conservative Republicans say, great, now we can sort of undo all these New Deal policies. We don't need to be spending this much money as a nation. We don't need to be providing this many social welfare programs for the American people. And they're actually met with a surprise. Modern republicanism is Eisenhower believing that the Republican Party has to change. They have to accept some of these New Deal programs because they were benefiting the American public. So modern republicanism describes Eisenhower's approach, and it's a compromise between conservative and liberal big government. Eisenhower often said we can be conservative with the budget and the money we spend, but we need to be liberal with people and do the right thing for Americans. So some of the things that he does is he surprises many within his party and even the Democrats, is that he keeps a lot of the New Deal programs in place and actually expands on them. So while he doesn't support universal health care like Truman did, he does feel that education, health, and welfare is important for every American. So Eisenhower, will find the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the president's cabinet, which is still there today, just broken into several different cabinet positions today. He also, too, surprisingly, to Democrats and even his own party, expands Social Security. He now offers Social Security to those who are self-employed and those who are disabled. Remember, Social Security prior to the 1950s mainly just focused on the elderly. And then lastly, we're going to see him domestically look at the issue of infrastructure. We're going to take a look at a second, the interstate highway system which Eisenhower pushes forth as president. And then lastly, we're really going to take a look at, coming up in a number of slides, the space race that starts to emerge during the Cold War years while he's president, his sort of stance on defense. And lastly, too, we'll come back to this in the next unit, but we're also going to too eventually get into Eisenhower's position on civil rights advancements for African Americans. So the first thing let's take a look at, another domestic policy, is the National Highway Act. Now, many people believe that the National Highway Act came for a need to provide better infrastructure for a growing American population. You know, we have more cars on the road. People were living outside of the cities, you know, between the urban centers and the farmlands. It's actually, those are all results or effects of the Highway Act. If you look at the proper name, which I have down here, it's actually the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956 that Eisenhower pushes for. And so really the objectives of the national highway system is national defense. Given that this is the Cold War, if we had to mobilize our armaments or our troops, we couldn't do that before 1956 effectively. So Eisenhower supports spending $25 billion and expanding the interstate system over 40,000 miles, again, in the name of national security and defense, that if we did ever go to the war with the Soviets, or if we were ever attacked or invaded, we would be able to mobilize very easily our troops and armaments. And so this is influenced by a few things. So Ike, as a young man in the U.S. Army in 1919, participated in the first Army convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And it was not an enjoyable experience. It was actually an eye-opener for many. Many people believed, you know, the roads, the infrastructure in that time period, right before the 1920s, it was a mess. And it took him several weeks to get across the country. And so that's going to shape and influence him. Also, too, during World War II in Germany, the German Autobahn during World War II is also an eye opener for Eisenhower. And as the Allies are making their way through Germany, they can see with ease, because of German infrastructure, they're able to go through the country. And so he brings that here to the United States and he pushes Congress to pass this legislation. Again, many people think that the highway system, it was created, it was initiated because we had a growing population after the war. We had people living in the suburbs. No, the real reason initially is national defense. What comes out of that as a result is then suburbia and people now living in these large tract communities. The other thing to take a look at too that Eisenhower has to deal with as president is a challenge we're going to see in 1957. Sputnik is going to be launched by the Soviets. The Soviet Union actually beats the United States to send a satellite into orbit. As you can see, the details and the facts of Sputnik, I mean, it only stayed in orbit for about 92 days, but this was a great achievement, something that the United States was working on for years prior and just couldn't get the program off the ground. And so while this is great for the Soviets, this impacts the United States greatly. Again, just getting off the heels of the second Red Scare, which had died down by 1955. You know, Americans are still fearful that now the Soviets can attack them with this new missile technology. Now that they were able to send this set missile and this satellite into air, how are they now going to perfect this technology to possibly even put a nuclear armament on? And now, without any warning at all, Americans could be struck by Soviet nuclear armaments. So, Americans after Sputnik now are resolved to gain technological superiority over the Soviet Union. Many Americans consider Sputnik in 1957 to be sort of a technological Pearl Harbor. And so that makes the United States really reevaluate a number of different things. First of all, what is our commitment, okay, to space exploration and space development? and it wasn't very good. It wasn't very organized. And Sputnik changes that. Year after Sputnik is going to be launched successfully, Eisenhower as president creates NASA. And again, it's now an organized agency that will now focus all its energy, all its attention on advancing American space capabilities, which we do very quickly. Again, I have to mention here in the 1950s, the last few years in the 1950s with NASA, NASA is really not strongly funded. That's not going to happen until John F. Kennedy is president, which is in 1960. John F. Kennedy, hence why things are named the Kennedy Space Center in Florida after him, is really the one that gets the program up and running. So Eisenhower starts it as a result of Sputnik, but doesn't really build the program. That'll come later in the 1960s, again, because of more Cold War tensions and John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade in the 1960s, which we do in July of 1969. It's a great achievement. The other thing we start evaluating as a result of Sputnik is education in the United States. And, the culture of the United States in the 1950s was very much relaxed. Teenagers were enjoying sock hops, school dances, they were going to drive-in movies, they were enjoying the new rock and roll music like Elvis Presley that was coming out, and they weren't so much focused on learning math and science, what you need in order to successfully beat the Soviets in the space race. So Sputnik also creates something called the National Defense Education Act. And that happens again several months after Sputnik. And what this did, it fueled education, especially in the area of math and science, but also foreign language. Again, we wanted Americans to be well versed in foreign languages during the time period of the Cold War to build those relationships and connections with foreign countries. And so it basically said if you are going to go to college to study math and science, we will front the bill. The federal government will pay for your education to advance that area in education in the United States. And then we're going to see, again, a high population of people entering colleges and studying beyond high school, and this act makes it absolutely possible. Some other effects to finish up on Sputnik 2 is that it's going to increase those atomic anxieties. So the Red Scare had started to alleviate by 1955. This absolutely, the launching of Sputnik resurfaces a lot of those tensions. And so, we have active shooter drills today in schools. Back in the 1950s, you had the duck and cover drills. You had these atomic drills that took place quite a bit. We're going to see the United States do more atomic testing. And you can see there from 45 to 92, we conduct over 1,000 nuclear tests, most of them in Nevada. But again, we want to keep developing weapon technology. And lastly, Americans become so paranoid. A lot of buildings that are built in the 1950s are going to have fallout shelters. Americans were buying do-it-yourself bomb shelters and building them in their basements or in their backyards in case we had a nuclear fallout. So switching gears a little bit, let's take a look at now how Eisenhower approached sort of foreign policy. What were our communist fears abroad and how did he approach them? Again, it's very different than what we looked at with Truman. And I do want you to mention a name in your notes before we begin really breaking down Eisenhower's policy. You should know John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles, pictured there with Eisenhower, is actually Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And so Dulles is going to drive a lot of Eisenhower's foreign policy. So I have sort of a comparison, okay, side by side comparison here. Again, as we looked at with Truman in the 1940s, very early 1950s, His policy towards advancing Soviet communism was containment. That was the architect of that, George Kennan, that said, again, we have to have long term policies to address this. And so the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, which gave funding for struggling nations to resist Soviet communism takeover. We had things like the Berlin airlift that demonstrated when challenged, we would stick up to Soviet advances. We had NATO, a network of alliances to help support our containment policy. And then finally, stepping up to North Korean advances into South Korea and containing that in the Korean War. Eisenhower takes a little bit of a different approach, actually, a quite extremely different approach. Eisenhower's policy towards Soviet communism, again, the architect of that is John Foster Dulles, is known as brinkmanship. And brinkmanship is simply the ideology that American politicians should not be afraid to bring the world to the brink of a nuclear war to really counter the advances of Soviet communism. So, if the Soviets are making gains, again, to put them in their place, we have to threaten the use of nuclear armament. So, it's pretty extreme. And so, what this looks at, brinkmanship, is something called deterrence. We would deter Soviet advancement into other countries, prevent the fall of other countries, like the domino theory, with being not afraid to use those nuclear weapons. The other part of it, too, with Eisenhower, in order to make that happen, you can threaten somebody, but you got to have the nuclear armaments to back it up, is a national security strategy called New Look. So Eisenhower also says we need to spend our resources not on building conventional armies and navies, but we need to spend our resources in advancing and developing more powerful nuclear weapons and also really air power in which to bomb and deliver these weapons. So we are starting to take a look at developing a new sort of section or division within the US military. And Eisenhower, many people would often use the phrase more bang for your buck. Instead, again, of conventional armies, which really at this time period weren't intimidating to the Soviet Union, we could then use our resources elsewhere, develop weapons that might then be more of a success in dealing with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower, we're going to look at this in a second, coming up with the U-2 incident, is also going to elevate the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and a lot of covert spying operations on the Soviets to see what they're up to look at Soviet military advancement. And then finally, another core part of his foreign policy is going to be the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Middle East absolutely was a hot point in the 1950s for the Soviet Union. They wanted to get their foothold into the Middle East. And so the Eisenhower Doctrine basically said a Middle Eastern country could request American economic assistance or even aid from our military force if it was being threatened by armed aggression. Although he's not specifically saying the Soviet Union, it's absolutely implied that we would come to the aid of those Middle Eastern countries. Unfortunately, there's going to be some damage done in relationships with Middle Eastern countries as a result of the Eisenhower Doctrine. A lot of Middle Eastern countries saw this as, us doing sort of moves to benefit us, the United States, and not the people of the Middle East. And so that's where we find a lot of souring relationships with Middle Eastern countries. They looked at the Eisenhower as just sort of a policy that would advance Western culture into Middle Eastern countries where it was not welcomed at all. So many people look at, was brinkmanship successful? And many historians look to a few events to say, no, it really wasn't. If anything, brinkmanship, the only thing it does is it elevates tensions that were already there and growing between the United States and the Soviet Union. And an event to really display how brinkmanship was not successful is the Hungarian uprising that takes place in 1956. So we're starting to see this in a number of different areas throughout the Soviet bloc. Again, the Soviet bloc is on the side of the Iron Curtain that's controlled by the Soviets. And so what happens here is Hungary, the capital of Budapest, actually starts seeing a number of young people, a number of students rise up and challenge Soviet authority there. You see in that top picture, these young protesters want Soviets out of their country, and they actually toppled the statue of Stalin. And so, again, what the United States should be doing is supporting these people, right? We don't. What this really shows is that the U.S. nuclear sledgehammer of brinkmanship was too heavy of a weapon. And very quickly, as you see within that bottom photograph, we're going to see the Soviet Union come in, use their tanks, use their brute force to really stop this grassroots movement of the Hungarian people rising up and trying to oust Soviet control from their country. Not every situation warrants the use of a nuclear weapon. And unfortunately, even though we said and we sort of, threatened the Soviet Union we were going to use nuclear armaments, we never really end up doing it. And they call our bluff. And that actually, brinkmanship, is going to make the United States in the end look very weak to the Soviet Union. So it's very much not a successful policy. It's very much counterproductive and harmful for the United States, not just toward the Soviet Union, but how all countries really looked at the United States. The other thing to transition as we finish up a couple last events here is it's important to mention that in 1953, Stalin dies and the Soviet Union loses its beloved leader. And so for a few years, there's sort of a number of different leaders that try their hand and people want to assume the power of taking over leadership of the USSR, but no one successfully does it until Nikita Khrushchev in 1956. And he's a new type of leader, the American people believe at first, compared to Joseph Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev actually believes the United States and the Soviet Union could peacefully coexist. So, really, in the beginning here, there's great hope for the future of American and Soviet relationships when we see Nikita Khrushchev rise to power in the Soviet Union. But there are some things that are occurring by the end of the 1950s that are cause for alarm. First of all, as you see in the bottom picture, we're going to see Nikita Khrushchev have a very close and supportive relationship and alliance with Fidel Castro. And in 1959, Castro is going to be the leader that's going to bring communism to Cuba. And Cuba, we'll be talking a little bit more about next week. It's very close proximity to the United States. This is worrisome for the United States. So right there, okay, it's a dynamic change in 59. And we start to see Eisenhower, before he's leaving office, do more and more surveillance. We have more spy planes flying over Cuba as well as the Soviet Union to see what they are up to. And this is going to lead us to our last major incident, the U-2 spy incident of 1960. This is going to take place right before Eisenhower leaves office of the presidency. And so what happens here is a U.S. pilot, Francis Gary Powers, his plane, U-2 spy plane you see pictured there, is shot down over Soviet airspace. And he's there on a spy mission, essentially. He's taking photographs with this equipment on the U-2 spy plane to see sort of military installments in the Soviet Union. What are they up to? So his plane shot down. You can see the wreckage is pretty severe. And many people at first, once the pictures get back to us in the United States, believe that Powers did not survive this, but indeed he did. So Dwight D. Eisenhower at first, okay, thinking that Powers did not survive this crash, just sort of plays it off that, nope, the U.S. wasn't involved, and sort of chalks it up. Oh, no, it was a U.S. plane, but we weren't spying on you. And then when he finds out later that Powers had survived, he knows there's a change here. We know that the Soviets had found the camera equipment on the plane, and they can clearly see that we're doing a spy sort of reconnaissance mission here on them. And so Eisenhower has to admit and sort of backstep that it was indeed a spy mission. This unfortunately blows up in his face, and it's really an unfortunate way for him to end his presidency. In response to this, Khrushchev cancels a long awaited summit in Paris between the US and him. And this really is what many historians believe could have been a major breakthrough in American and Soviet relations. And because of the U 2 spy incident, because of Eisenhower's deception and dishonesty and not owning up to it right away, this summit is canceled. Now, Powers is found alive, as I mentioned. He is tried. There's a picture of his trial up there in the top corner, and he's actually sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison for his role in this espionage. But about a year and a half later, after serving, we're going to see the Soviets release him in exchange for a Soviet swap. We have a Soviet spy, Rudolf Abel, that they want to get their hands on and get him back. And so we negotiate this. But unfortunately, Eisenhower's policies throughout the 1950s regarding brinkmanship, but also to this U 2 spy incident, the very end of his presidency, is only going to add to increasing buildup of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union when we had an opportunity to try to help alleviate them. And so Eisenhower, again, a very popular president throughout the 1950s, it really contributes to, again, the growth of prosperity, wealth of many Americans. He says goodbye to the country in 1961 with his famous, farewell address. And this farewell address is unlike a lot of others. We always look at farewell addresses of presidents and they want to sort of leave a lasting message to the American people. And Eisenhower's is interesting considering his background as a military man. In his speech, it really focuses on warning Americans of something he coins called the military industrial complex. And this is when a nation's economy is dependent quite heavily on the armament industry. As he says in the speech, we have 3.5 million men and women who are directly engaged and employed in the defense establishment. And we spend annually more on our military than what we see as the whole net income of all American corporations. And so this is rather interesting. Many historians think it's a way of Eisenhower, again, a military man who has devoted his life to the military, sort of reflecting and maybe without outright saying it, sort of owning up to some of the mistakes that his administration made. And also, too, warning Americans that this military industrial complex will only fuel our involvement in future wars. And that's something that we absolutely want to be mindful of moving into the new decade of the 1960s. So that's where I'm going to stop there. Okay. Those are the major highlights, major policies, both domestic and foreign, of Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Take care, guys.